Good evening, friends, and welcome to the Keese School once again. Our speaker tonight is Mark Mannion, and I'm pleased to hand the mic over to Mark's father, Diamond resident Ron Mannion, who will introduce his son.
Good evening. It is a special evening for me to introduce my favorite oldest son, Mark, of whom I am so proud. He is quite modest, as he left out in the Keese catalog that he graduated from Tufts University in International Relations and received his PhD from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. He also served on the Council of Foreign Relations under Richard Haas. He served in the Congressional Research Service for 26 years. When he crossed the 38th parallel to examine for Congress an industrial complex built in an effort to improve relations between the North and the South, he earned a badge of honor when the North State media insulted Mark by saying, "Don't listen to what Dr. Mannion is saying." By the way, as I welcome Mark to the podium, if you like his presentation, you can say he's a chip off the old block.
I think my younger brother would also say something similar to what North Korea said about don't pay any attention to anything Mark has to say. Dad, when you say chip off the old block, it makes me think of the Japanese equivalent of that is the son of a frog is a frog. And so to the old frog, thank you for introducing me. And I'd like to also thank Kate and everyone at the Keese School for having me come speak. You've been such a great part of my dad's life since he moved here 2 years ago, little over 2 years ago, right, Dad? And my wife, who's also here, she and I have also benefited from the Keese School. It's just such a wonderful example of what a vibrant community it is here at Asbury that we've been blessed to sort of be a part of sort of residually through my father. So it's just an honor to be able to come and speak to you all and give back a little bit. So as my father said, I work at an organization called the Congressional Research Service. I don't know, have any of you heard of CRS or so quite a few of you, okay. Has anyone worked on Capitol Hill at all? Maybe one or two, no? Okay. So for those of you who don't know what CRS is, we are an organization that works just for Congress. And we're kind of like an in-house think tank for members of Congress and staff. We're not a huge organization, but we're not small either. We're about 600 people. And about 400 or so are analysts like me who do research, and we produce reports, we do memos, et cetera. Those of you who know what we do are probably familiar with us most through our reports, which are available online. And they're terrific resources, if I do say so myself. But that's only a fraction of the work we do. Much more important are the customized requests that we take in from Congress and staff. And we take in tens of thousands of requests from members of Congress and their staff every year. And basically, we exist to help to basically, hopefully, make Congress, have Congress do a better job. So if they have any questions at all on any topic, they can come to us. Now, I cover Asia, particularly East Asia. So I cover the two Koreas, Japan, and Southeast Asia. But we have specialists who cover just about any topic under the sun. Essentially, we're trying to mirror the executive branch to give Congress a way to, in its battle and sometimes cooperation, these days it's more cooperation, of course, with the executive branch. We're there to provide Congress with more information than they would have otherwise. A couple of other things I'll say about CRS is that because we work for all of Congress, so for Republicans, Democrats, Independents, Socialists, et cetera, in our forming statute, the law that created us, we are prohibited from taking positions. So basically, we are there to provide information and analysis for members of Congress so that they can make the decisions. So that's why, for those of you who have seen our work, you'll see that we have to be objective, and we'll often be, sort of two-handed. We'll say, on the one hand, some people say this, and the other hand, other people say that. Basically, we're trying to provide members of Congress with the information and the options, like I said, for them to make their decisions. And so you'll probably see a lot of that character come out in my talk tonight. Basically, we exist so that, in a world where Congress has so many options that they can go to, from lobbyists, from think tanks, from pundits, et cetera, all of whom, or almost all of whom, have some sort of agenda or a bias that they're trying to push. Congress created us because they wanted an independent source of information that they could come to on a confidential basis to help them sort of navigate in this sea of information and analysis that's out there. So I'm happy to talk more about CRS when you have questions about what we do, because we are rather unique, what we do and how we do it. I'm also happy to talk about the current situation now, with the shutdown and with other events going on, particularly with Congress's relationship with the Trump administration. So we can get into that later during Q&A. So, but the substance of the talk will be on North Korea. And when I first set the title of the talk, how many months ago? When was it, Kate? In February, March, or something? I was hoping that we would have more information about U.S.-North Korea relations. And we really haven't, as I'll get into in a minute. And as I'll say, though, the sort of the music that is growing right now, that we may have some developments coming up, particularly between President Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, that there's a small possibility we'll have some sort of breakthrough in the coming weeks. But again, I'll get into that in a minute. So first, let me just start off by talking about the current situation, and then I'll talk about some options that we have. Right now, North Korea poses one of the most critical threats to the United States right now, to the U.S. homeland, to U.S. allies, and to U.S. interests. And that threat is just growing and growing. In fact, The Economist this week has a whole briefing about, three-page briefing about how the North Korean threat to the world is growing and is becoming a much more difficult problem to deal with than during President Trump's first term, 5-6 years ago. North Korea has tested 6 nuclear weapons, so it's a nuclear power. A 7th test could come really at any time. It's improving its missile capability to the point where it can probably hit the continental United States. It's developing submarine capabilities, so to the point where It would surprise no one who follows North Korea that if North Korea could launch its nuclear weapons from its submarines, which would give it a whole new class of capability, basically the nuclear triad, to come closer to that for those of you who are familiar with sort of, deterrence and nuclear capabilities. More recently, over the last year and a half, North Korea has developed or redeveloped its alliance with Russia, which potentially gives it access to Russian technology, which is only going to improve its capabilities quite a bit, and also make it more potentially aggressive as well. On top of that, since the breakdown of negotiations between President Trump and Kim Jong-un 6 years ago, North Korea has been refusing to negotiate. It's refusing to negotiate not just with the United States, but also with South Korea. And if you remember, and here now we get some pictures, President Trump, when he was during his first term, met with Kim Jong-un 3 times. The first was in Singapore in 2018. And this was the first significant because it was the first time that a US president had ever met with a leader from North Korea. So it was a real path-breaking meeting. And that meeting produced a very broad-based framework agreement for negotiations. I won't get into that in detail now, but if you have questions, we can get into that. They then had a second meeting about 8 months later in Hanoi. This meeting did not go well, and sort of the body language there shows that a little bit. There were high hopes that the summit in Hanoi would lead to more details and a real breakthrough following on that framework agreement that the two had reached in Singapore. But the negotiations broke down. And the negotiations broke down primarily over how much North Korea would be dismantling its nuclear weapons program. And again, I can get into more details if you'd like, because there's a lot that can be said both about North Korea's expectations, but also about how President Trump sort of organized the negotiations and ran his administration as well in the lead up to those negotiations, which could be quite interesting for current US policy as well. The third meeting the two leaders had was at the demilitarized zone that separates North and South Korea, also in 2019. And here's a picture of the two of them smiling, shaking hands. And there was a terrific photo op of President Trump at Kim Jong-un's invitation crossing over into, you see that little dividing line there, the concrete there, actually crossing into North Korean territory, because that's sort of the official border area in this part of Panmunjom of the demilitarized zone. And it was quite unexpected. President Trump has said that the Secret Service got really nervous when Kim Jong-un said, "Hey, you want to come over the border?" And he stepped over with him there. Have any of you been to the demilitarized zone at all? Yeah, some people. Okay, so it's a really it's just a surreal location, as anyone who's been there can say. In some ways, very peaceful, but just there are guards and mines everywhere that you look. Coincidentally, literally the week before President Trump went to the DMZ, I actually happened to be there, that's me second from the left, with some colleagues. And so you can't quite see it, but that little boundary there is just in the back by those blue buildings. So we had no idea that no one really had any idea that President Trump was going to be at the DMZ 1 week later. It was a real surprise that was going to be had. And this is where I say that, the crescendo, the music is growing, that there may be some sort of meeting coming up in the coming weeks, because there have been signs that perhaps that President Trump may be meeting with Kim Jong-un again. President Trump is due in October to travel to South Korea, where there's going to be a big summit of the APEC group, which is the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Group. It's a group of several dozen countries from around the Asia-Pacific. It does not include North Korea, but because it's going to be held in South Korea, there's speculation that the South Koreans might invite Kim Jong-un to come and meet. And here, let me see if I could zoom in. So this is obviously a map of the Korean Peninsula. And so the summit's going to be right around here, if you could follow the cursor, in a city of Gyeongju, which is sort of a historic capital of South Korea. Now, Kim Jong-un, no North Korean leader has ever traveled to South Korea. So this would be quite, I would not bet on this happening, but of Kim Jong-un going actually to South Korea as part of the summit. But perhaps President Trump may decide to make another trip up to the demilitarized zone to Panmunjom, which is right here in this area between Kaesong and Munsan, just north of Seoul. By the way, the site that the industrial zone that my father mentioned that I traveled to was here at the city, just outside of the city of Kaesong. And this was a really interesting project that the two Koreas set up for about 10 years, from about 2004 to 2014, 2015, which involved South Korean corporations working inside North Korea, employing North Korean workers. And at one point, this grew to include close to 100,000 North Korean workers. And the idea was that by employing these workers, it would help to sort of create a group of North Koreans that would start to learn basically capitalism, right? How to work with Western-oriented companies. And the hope was that that would sort of spill over then to other areas of the North Korean economy that would improve things for North Korea. It didn't work out that way for a lot of reasons, and eventually, when North Korea became more aggressive in sort of launching more nuclear weapons, launching more missiles, about 10 years ago, South Korea decided to pull the plug on the Kaesong industrial complex. This was right around the time, if you can remember, from about 10 years ago, during the whole Fire and Fury era, when President Trump was threatening to launch Fire and Fury against North Korea. It was right around that time, just a year or two before that South Korea pulled the plug on the Kaesong industrial complex. I can say it was a memorable experience. I think my wife gained some more gray hairs when I went into North Korea. So I'd be happy to talk more about that. Particularly, there were some little bit harrowing moments where the South Koreans who brought me up there sort of just left me alone with my North Korean minders. But I can say more about that if you have questions. So let me say, whoops, back up here. So as I said, the North Korean threat to the United States is growing. So what can be done? There are lots of different options that President Trump, like any US president, could be faced with or to have, as well as Congress. One is punishment. And here, principally, we're talking about sanctions. North Korea is one of the most heavily, the problem is that North Korea already is one of the most heavily sanctioned countries in the world. We have, since they started becoming more aggressive, as I said, about 10 years ago with these missile launches, with more nuclear tests, at that time, first President Obama, followed by President Trump, launched a vigorous international campaign at the United Nations. So yes, President Trump was cooperating with folks at the UN to launch a campaign to tighten restrictions against North Korea. At this point, about 80 to 90% of the products that North Korea was exporting in 2015 they're banned from exporting, at least officially. And many of the things that they were importing at the time, they're also banned from importing. The problem is, as with many sanctions regimes, is they start to leak. At first they were vigorously enforced. Again, thanks to, in part, the Obama administration's policy and then the early Trump administration's policy. The United States actually got quite a bit of cooperation from the rest of the world, including China and Russia, who were acting pretty vigorously in 2016 and 2017 to impose these sanctions against North Korea, to basically pressure North Korea to freeze, if not give up, its nuclear weapons. Over time, however, as I said, that sanctions regime has gotten leakier and leakier, to the point where North Korea is getting many, many of its products from abroad. In fact, North Korea has started in its more recent missile tests that it's launched, when sort of people have gotten the missile parts, they've launched them up, they come down into the waters, and many ships, like Japanese ships, American ships, et cetera, they get those missiles and they're able to see what's inside them. They found lots of American semiconductors, Japanese gyroscopes, et cetera. So even though these products are all prohibited from getting into North Korea is finding a way to get them. And the assumption is that they're getting them through China and Russia, perhaps not with the cooperation of the Chinese government and Russian governments, but certainly those two governments are not doing enough to cut off North Korea's getting these products. And then there are lots of other products like textiles, fish, other things that are not supposed to be, coal, oil, that are not supposed to be traded with North Korea, that North Korea is doing plenty of trade of, again, with the cooperation of companies from China and Russia, as well as other countries. So what can be done? Oops, sorry. Since North Korea itself cannot be targeted directly with sanctions, the next way to go would be to sanction the countries that are doing business with North Korea. So that primarily means China and now Russia. And again, here the problem is we're already sanctioning Russia because of its invasion of Ukraine in 2022, right? So that leaves China. So the question remains, is the United States ready to escalate in a major way pressure on China when we've got all these other things that are going on with China, the trade war, we've got potential conflict with Taiwan, potential conflict in the South China Sea, et cetera. So it's an open question whether the Trump administration would want to take the step to really sanction Chinese companies because of their doing business with North Korea or not. But nonetheless, that is one option that members of Congress and the Trump administration have. Another is to increase pressure generally against North Korea. Now, this could take the form of sanctions itself, but there are lots of other things that could be done as well. North Korea, as I'm sure many of you know, for example, has one of the worst human rights regimes in the world. Kim Jong-un rules with an iron fist, and the repression of the regime has just continued to increase over the last few years, particularly after the COVID pandemic. He's just tightened his control. Interestingly, though, even as the human rights situation inside North Korea has gotten worse over the last 5 years, the US pressure in a lot of ways on human rights has relaxed. Really, this started with the first Trump administration, and it's sort of just continued as well. So this could be an area where, if the U.S. government wanted to do something about North Korea's nuclear weapons, they could decide to tighten pressure by going back to the policy of about 10 years ago, where we were going around the world and sort of calling out North Korea's human rights regime, human rights repression, and using that as a way to shame countries and companies who are still doing business with North Korea and saying, hey, do you really want to be doing business with the world's worst human rights abuser? And then if they didn't stop doing it, to then name them and shame them. This had a big impact about 10 years ago, to such a point that North Korea was really, really getting upset and started to retaliate in a number of ways, which again I can get into if you have questions. So that's just one example of an area where if the U.S. wanted to, if the Trump administration wanted to, it could put more pressure on North Korea. And of course, my institution, Congress, could also, as it has done in the past, could put pressure on the Trump administration to, in turn, put pressure on North Korea because of human rights. In fact, very often, many of the things that the U.S. government does on human rights are because of congressional pressure for a variety of reasons. A third option available is to attack North Korea militarily. In fact, this is something that the first Trump administration in 2017 was seriously considering. I can remember, I was on vacation, I don't know if you remember this, Hun. In 2017, in August, we were on vacation, and I started getting these texts from friends and colleagues saying, are we about to attack North Korea? Because President Trump, this is when he said, we will launch, Kim Jong-un thinks he has a big nuclear button, but the United States has an even bigger one. I have a bigger one on my desk, and I can press it, and we will rain fire and fury on North Korea like it has never been seen before. And at the time, there was a lot of bluster, but behind that bluster, the Trump administration was actually making plans to launch what it called a bloody nose strike against North Korea to try and get North Korea to, if it wouldn't relinquish its nuclear weapons program, that we would go in and destroy it, much as we tried to do with Iran earlier this year. Likewise, about a year ago in South Korea, the previous South Korean president, his name was President Yoon, many people believe he took steps to actually provoke North Korea into launching a war that he then, in South Korea, would then go in, as an excuse to go in and take out North Korea's nuclear weapons. So this is something that has actually been seriously considered in the not too distant past. The problem is it's risky. Back in 2017, when we got word that the first Trump administration was considering this, we decided to write a report on the pros and cons of a war with North Korea. And one of the cons was just the potential for massive, massive casualties on the peninsula. And here I'm going to jump back a little bit to just show you this map here. This is sort of a zoom in right around the demilitarized zone, which is this red line here that separates the two Koreas. You can see here the capital of South Korea, Seoul, is just so close to the border with North Korea, essentially 40 miles or so. And all along this demilitarized zone, North Korea has hundreds, if not thousands, of artillery shells that mainly are pointed at Seoul. And in Seoul and the greater Seoul area, you've got about 20 million people living there. So about 40% of South Korea's population. And this, in a nutshell, sums up the dilemma of dealing with North Korea, is that if you do anything that seriously provokes North Korea, they hold Seoul hostage. Because putting aside their nuclear weapons, putting aside their long-range missiles, just with their artillery alone, they can reach and just rain massive, massive casualties on Seoul. When we looked at this most recently, the estimates were that anywhere between 30 and 300,000 people would be dead in the first days of fighting if a war were to break out. And again, this is just not even getting into North Korea's nuclear weapons, its missiles, and it has chemical weapons, has biological weapons, et cetera. So a war with North Korea, or even just a skirmish with North Korea, could be quite risky. And that's why, some people have been quite reluctant to even talk about the possibility of a nuclear attack, or I'm sorry, an attack on North Korea. Fourth option is engagement. As I mentioned before, President Trump tried this back in 2018 and 2019. South Korea has also tried doing this. We have a new president in South Korea who is quite eager to sort of re-engage with North Korea. As I said, right now Kim Jong-un has said he has no interest in engaging with South Korea. But interestingly, he, just in the last week or so, he has said that he remembers very fondly his meetings with President Trump. He enjoyed them, and he would welcome meeting President Trump again. President Trump likewise has said, Kim Jong-un and I got along great. They famously, in the international relations field, they exchanged lots of letters that President Trump has described as love letters at the time. And he said, look, I'd be happy to meet with Kim Jong-un. We have lots to talk about. The problem is that Kim Jong-un has said, if we're going to meet again, we're not going to talk about denuclearization. I will not give up my nuclear weapons. And the United States and South Korea, our official policy is, towards North Korea, is North Korea must denuclearize. Now, there are ways around those two positions. They aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. But, and I can get into those if you want to and during questions. But clearly, you can see that there's a problem. Like, what are we going to talk about if we want them to denuclearize, and they're saying they're refusing to do that? So, nonetheless, it will be interesting to see over the coming weeks if we get a meeting between President Trump and North Korean leader Kim in South Korea coming up. Fifth option, deterrence. And here, this is something that basically all US administrations have been doing, and the Trump administration appears poised to continue doing it. Basically, deterrence means you're trying to prevent another country from doing something that you don't want them to do, or that they want to do. And so to try and deter North Korea, the United States and South Korea have been boosting their capabilities. We've also been expanding our cooperation with Japan as well. For example, Japan, for the first time since World War II, is developing its own long-range missile capabilities so that they, for the first time on their own, would be able to launch missiles that would actually land in North Korea, China as well. Now, this was something that was begun under President Biden and the previous South Korean president. And so far, President Trump has been continuing these policies of expanding the capabilities of both the US military forces and South Korean military forces as well. However, there are a lot of questions about where President Trump is going to go with this, because very famously, he has made some comments that have been very critical, questioning the value of allies and US alliances in general. After his first meeting with Kim Jong-un in Singapore in 2018, for example, he unilaterally said, after the meeting, he said, well, we reached this agreement, the North Korean nuclear threat is gone, and so we don't need to really hold the bilateral military exercises with South Korea anymore. In fact, we may be thinking about taking our troops out of South Korea. Right now, the United States has about almost 30,000 soldiers in South Korea. So we may be withdrawing them. He did this without consulting with South Korea ahead of time. He said this. He also said this without even consulting with the folks in the Pentagon, apparently, as well. So even though the Trump administration has been continuing its policy for the moment, there are lots of questions because President Trump is rather unpredictable about whether he would take these steps that would undermine deterrence in the future. So, these are the 5 sets of options, at least that I see, that President Trump faces, and something that will be tested in the future coming up. Why don't I stop there, because I've thrown a lot out at you, and I'd be happy to take questions, again, about North Korea, about US policy, about CRS. If there are no questions, I'm happy to keep talking. So it's a way to give you incentives to ask questions. So, Kate, how do you want to do this? Do you want to take them, or do you want me to just call on people?
Actually, the ushers will come and point to someone, and then you can take that question.
Okay.
So I think there's a question in the front here, several in the front. So you can come on down.
How would you characterize the goals of North Korea? What's their ultimate goal?
I was hoping somebody would ask that.
Good.
Yes. So, even the way you phrase that question is terrific because, and this is something we wrestle with in writing about a country, because it's, I say, and I do this all the time, I'll say, North Korea says this, or just South Korea says this, the United States says this, but of course, what is North Korea, right? It's, there are many parts to a country. So the way I would answer that question is I would say, first off, there is the North Korean regime, right? Which essentially is, because it's a totalitarian one-man rule, it boils down to Kim Jong-un, right? And what most analysts who focus on North Korea would say is that the number one goal of Kim Jong-un and the regime is to preserve his survival, right? His survival, his rule, his family, and the system that props him up. Again, in the world's just most repressive, arguably most repressive regime. So that's their goal. And from North Korea's point of view, if you look out at the rest of the world, North Korea is one of the poorest countries in the world, right? Right across the demilitarized zone, you've got one of the world's richest countries. South Korea, a country of 50 million people, has probably the world's 11th largest economy, for example. And anyone who has been to South Korea just can see it is just a rich, rich country. It's K-pop is everywhere, K-movies, et cetera. I just watched K-pop Demon Hunters, for example. And of course, China and Russia have been important partners for North Korea. Most recently, Russia's been an ally of North Korea. But can North Korea really trust them? And then, if you're looking out, you've got South Korea as allied with the United States, the world's most powerful country militarily. As I said, there are about 30,000 troops in South Korea. South Korea's relations with Japan, which obviously is a very powerful country, also are growing. Japan is allied with the United States. The United States has about 50,000 troops in Japan. So if you're North Korea, you're looking out at the region, and it's a pretty threatening place, right? So on top of, in order to preserve your regime, what's the best way to do that? Nukes, right? Nuclear weapons, number one, and figure out better and better ways to deliver those nuclear devices. So that's where the missiles come in, all right? And over the last 30 years, North Korea has been testing and refining its missile capability to the point where they can pretty easily, with their medium-range missiles, reach not only South Korea, but now Japan, also some US territories like Guam, for instance. And now the big question is, two big questions are, can they develop their long-range missiles, their ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, to reach and come down in the United States wherever they want, number one. And number two, can they take their nuclear weapons and shrink them or miniaturize them and put them on the warhead of those missiles to basically bring a nuclear weapon down on an American city? Because if North Korea can do that, going back to the deterrence option that I mentioned before, North Korea wants to deter us and South Korea, right? So all of a sudden, if an American president has to worry that, okay, if I get into a war with North Korea, does that mean that they're going to launch a nuclear weapon on San Francisco or Seattle or even farther east? And so this creates all kinds of doubts in the minds of American policymakers, but also policymakers in South Korea and Japan as well. But all that, going back to your question, is to help preserve the Kim regime and preserve its time in power. But you could see how the logic of that would lead it to divert almost all of its resources into its military, including its nuclear and missile programs.
I had the next thing. I think pretty much everybody's pretty obsessed with the Kim Jong-un family. I understand he's grooming his 14-year-old daughter, and you now see her instead of his wife with him. I'm also curious, they used to have incredible starvation, and I wondered if that was still true in North Korea.
So yes, about 30 years ago, during the Cold War, North Korea relied very, very heavily on subsidies from China and Russia. With the end of the Cold War, that came to an end. And that triggered essentially an economic collapse inside North Korea, starting in the mid-1990s, that led to a horrific famine, where it's estimated that anywhere from 5 to 10%, of the population died. You had thousands, if not tens, hundreds of thousands of North Korean refugees going into China. Many of them made their way into South Korea eventually. And that situation seems to have stabilized, in part because of the international community came in, led by the United States, provided huge amounts of food assistance to North Korea. Again, this was from the United States, from China, South Korea, Japan, many other countries. 20 years ago, we were providing hundreds of tons of food aid to North Korea. North Korea used that to stabilize the situation to the point where today it's believed, and I'm going to give a caveat in a minute to what I'm about to say, but it's believed that while you don't have a famine anymore, you also have sort of severe food shortages. Obviously the elite are getting what they want, right? As always, as happens everywhere. And let me just go back to the map here. I'm going to zoom in on North Korea, hang on. The elite, who primarily live in Pyongyang, in the capital city, are getting what they want, but people outside of Pyongyang, there are believed to be food, and there's evidence of food shortages. But it's more like a chronic problem, where it's sort of a chronic malnutrition problem. You see this, for example, in many of the refugees that do make their way to South Korea. Very famously, at least in the sort of North Korea watcher community, about 7-8 years ago, there was a North Korean soldier, you might remember, who escaped over the demilitarized zone, which doesn't happen very often. And when he came, he had worms, parasites in his stomach. North Korean soldiers generally are shorter than South Korean soldiers because of this malnutrition. So food appears to be a problem, although not at the famine conditions it was before. Now, this is the last thing I'll say on this. The caveat is that because North Korea has sealed itself off since the COVID pandemic and has basically not reopened itself, they kicked out all the international aid workers. They kicked out almost all the foreign embassies. Right now, they've only let back in the Chinese, the Russians, and maybe two or three others. So we just aren't getting the same amount of information about what's going on inside North Korea. So it's hard to say, but the information is that food continues to be a problem. And this is an issue with totalitarian regimes, is that you don't have to worry about, as long as you keep the population at a certain level of development, right, you don't have to worry about accountability. And so the regime is able to divert so many resources from the rest of the population into their own coffers and into the military.
I have a little question. So many times, and this is not just your talk, it's everything I see on TV, when they talk about where North Korean missiles can reach, they never seem to take into account Alaska. And they talk about reaching the continental United States. Last time I looked, Alaska was in the continent of North America. And so, can you reflect at all on that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's just because of the population centers. And certainly there would be, the Alaska contingent, in Congress would very much agree with you. Say, wait, what about us? Right? And I should add that there are some key sites for the U.S. missile defense that are based in Alaska. Our missile defense is primarily oriented not necessarily against China or Russia, but against North Korea and Iranian missiles. That would be something that the North Koreans would be looking very carefully at, those sites as well. So Alaska definitely plays a big part in sort of the whole strategic calculus in looking at North Korea. I think, people tend not to focus on it as much because, so the saying is, would the U.S. be willing to sacrifice Seattle for Seoul or San Francisco for Seoul? If you say Anchorage for Seoul, it just doesn't quite have the same ring to it, and not just because of the alliteration, but because of the population centers. The average American may not know about Anchorage, so I think it has more to do with that. But you're absolutely right. Part of the worry too is not just Alaska, but the U.S. has lots of territories in the Pacific. I mentioned Guam is one, for example. So you have hundreds of thousands of Americans, who are living, in the Pacific who could be, threatened by North Korean missiles as well, and that can be a problem too.
Yes, with the continual strengthening of North Korea, et cetera, what do you see as the end game of all this? They're getting, day by day, they're getting stronger.
Yeah, one of the frustrations of being a North Korea analyst is that, and this I'm going to go back to, these options, like they've all been tried and they haven't worked. I mean, they've slowed down North Korea. So, engagement has been tried, with President Trump. 20 years before then, the South Koreans had a very aggressive engagement strategy toward North Korea that they called the Sunshine Policy. And the Kaesong industrial complex that I mentioned before, that was a big part of it. That didn't work. Putting pressure on North Korea hasn't worked. So, it's not clear what's gonna work. I think the most realistic scenario is a pretty grim one, that will continue to muddle along in the current situation where North Korea makes steadily, bit by bit, more and more gains to its missile programs, its nuclear programs, And by the way, one of the risks here is that as North Korea starts getting more and more nuclear material, is that they'll actually get to a point where they may feel like, oh, we don't actually need all of this for ourselves, and they can start selling it, right? So you get the problem of proliferation. North Korea has already, helped Syria to build a nuclear reactor, which the Israelis about 20 years ago destroyed. So we already have an example of North Korea, spreading its nuclear technology. So all of this can continue, whereas meanwhile, the United States and the rest of the world are focused on other issues, more pressing issues, the war in Ukraine, for example, the situation in the Middle East. So the likelihood, again, most realistically, is that this will continue to build until there's some sort of crisis. What does that mean? It could be conflict over Taiwan that North Korea takes advantage of. It could be North Korea deciding that it doesn't like the status quo and starting to attack here, launch some sort of attacks here. These islands here, even though they're right off the coast of North Korea, they're actually South Korean islands. So North Korea could decide, oh, we want to maybe take back some of those islands, for instance, and force a crisis. North Korea might launch or test another nuclear device. Anyway, that there'll be some sort of crisis that will force the issue. And going back to your question earlier, what does North Korea want? What North Korea might want to try and do is force the United States to come to the negotiating table and accept North Korea as a nuclear power and basically start dealing with North Korea on that basis. And again, the challenge for a US policymaker is if you decide to do that, is there a way to do that while getting some gains by convincing North Korea to somehow reduce the threat to the United States and to US allies? One way to do that might be, for example, to say, okay, we're not going to insist that you give up your nuclear weapons right away, but we will insist that you have a freeze on your nuclear program and no more testing of your nuclear weapon, of your missiles, right? And that you must accept international inspectors to go inside North Korea, for example, something that North Korea has never, hasn't accepted in quite some time. So these are all some options that could happen. But it's hard to imagine a situation where North Korea, whereas 10 years ago, you could perhaps imagine North Korea giving up its nuclear weapons, small chance, but there was still a chance. Now that's dwindled to almost zero because North Korea is in such a stronger position today, as I mentioned before. So the outlook is pretty grim. I hate to say it. And I will say that, for all the criticism of President Trump for his policy towards North Korea several years ago, there is a chance that because of who he is, his personality, and his relationship with Kim Jong-un, that there could be some sort of breakthrough that at least will make the situation better than what it is today. However, I would think that many people who follow North Korea would hope that he would run the negotiations better than he did the first time around, because a lot of the ways that he ran them 10 years ago did not work out so well. Yeah. Oh, there. Yeah.
I was in the U.S. Embassy in Seoul political section at the time that we talked the South Koreans out of developing a nuclear weapon. This whole business of dealing with North Korea, and now that North Korea has formed an alliance, a more visible alliance with China and Russia, gives the impression that they've already decided which way they want to lean. What do we have to offer them that's going to be better than what they can get from Russia and China, even though they are sounding a little bit less enthusiastic about China lately, even after their appearance in Beijing. They're not showing any signs of giving up being a part of that triumvirate, which makes them much safer than anything we can offer.
So, and I should add, when you were based in Seoul, this was when? What years? Early 70s?
That would have been 75 to 78, 9, that period.
Right. That was a period when the situation between North and South Korea was much, much bloodier than it is today. There were frequent clashes and incursions across the demilitarized zone, and a level of conflict and violence that, quite frankly, we would be shocked at today. I think, because this was a period of war, the Vietnam War in particular, and so much focus was on Vietnam, that it didn't, of course it generated headlines here, but not to the same extent that it would if the scale of these incidents happened today. But, I think, this is a question: what can we offer North Korea that would, induce them even to come to the table, let alone give up or freeze their nuclear weapons program? Part of the hope, and this again is something that President Trump but other leaders, in South Korea have dangled in front of North Korea, is better economic conditions. In the past, that seemed to be part of North Korea's, what their motivation was. For, a generation, North Korean leaders, including Kim Jong-un, one of their goals appeared to be to get better relations with the United States. And as part of that, they would get a reduction in the sanctions that I mentioned earlier, so that they could do business with the rest of the world, right? And that would lead to growing prosperity for North Korea. It's not clear that North Korea would want that right now, because again, as you said, they're doing okay. The regime is doing well enough that they have survived. They got through COVID, which during the COVID pandemic, North Korea closed off its borders, as I mentioned before. They basically sanctioned themselves and were doing no business at all, no trading at all with the outside world. Many people thought that was going to be the end of the regime, right? That the regime would just collapse, but it didn't. In fact, and like I said, it's doing okay because of its relationship with China and North Korea. So this is a real dilemma. What do they want? If we dangled sanctions relief in front of them, if we dangled economic development assistance for them, would they even want that, to come to the table? So, yeah, So I don't have a good answer for that, but that's, yeah.
Okay, here's my question. Mark, I have a very special interest in your talk tonight because my favorite son, Charlie Stretch, is a colonel in the United States Air Force located at Osan Air Force Base, very close to the DMZ zone in North Korea. And so are my 3 grandchildren there, and his wife, who's also in the Air Force. So of your number, your 30,000 people, 30,000 soldiers, USA, that are there, are airmen included in that number, or is that part of the whole military USA force there?
Yes, airmen are included in that number. And most U.S. forces are ground troops, but there is a significant number of airmen as well, and airwomen, yeah. Yeah. And I should say that in your grandkids and your son's family are part of there are roughly about 250,000 Americans living in South Korea. Most of them are presumably in this area, this 20 million that I mentioned, in and around the greater Seoul area. So, yeah, that's part of that concern about, the risk of conflict that we have to worry about.
Let me get to the microphone here.
Sure.
I know we all thank Mark so much. We're so fortunate
My dad will have to ask me his question later.
Yes. Well, I was just going to say, I know there are a lot of questions, and if Mark can stay for a little while, he'll be at the front of the stage, and you can come forward and ask your questions. But as I started to say, we're so fortunate to have someone with this level of expertise to explain this very complex situation. So thank you again, Mark, so
you.
much. So as usual, I'm just going to briefly introduce our next presentation. Our next lecture will be about Diwali, the festival of light that symbolizes the victory of light over darkness and knowledge over ignorance. That sounds good, doesn't it? Diwali is celebrated all over the world and increasingly so in the United States. Our speaker is Jag Bhargava. Jag was born in India and now lives in the Courtyard Homes with his wife, Sandy. Rhoda McKenzie will host the lecture this coming Thursday right here in Roseboro at 7:30, so hope to see you there.